There was a practical tenderness in the preparations that followed. He wrote brief notes to settle affairs with the same plain, efficient hand he had used all his life. He tidied small debts, arranged for messengers to carry final words to those he loved, and settled the modest accounts of a man who never courted luxury. There was no spectacle, no grand protest, no accusatory manifesto, only a man closing his life as he had lived it, with deliberation and restraint. On the appointed day, Cato rose before dawn and walked through the garden. The horizon smudged from gray to rose. He paused to touch the marble column where in other years debate had rung out like fire. He thought briefly of Rome's past, of laws deliberated, of men whose names had been carved into memory, and then of the present, where those same traditions had been bent and broken by force. He did not rail at fate. He measured it and placed himself within its lines. His friends tried in earnest to dissuade him. "There is honor yet in flight," one murmured. "There is a place to live and teach, to persist in exile and keep your voice alive." Another urged cunning. "Survive now, resist later." Cato received these pleas with gratitude and sorrow, but without capitulation. To live to fight another day is not always a coward's act, he acknowledged. But to live shamefully is not living at all. "I shall not barter my integrity for the illusion of continued years. My life," Cato said, his voice neither pleading nor theatrical, "is for what is right. If life itself requires the surrender of what I hold sacred, my duty to the laws, my refusal to flatter power, then I will not preserve it at the cost of my soul." He did not preach, he explained. He weighed each syllable as if testing its virtue. His friends gathered one last time. Some sat close, hands clasped. Others stood, pale but resolute. Someone offered comfort in awkward human instinct, but Cato's attention was on the enduring truth that had guided him, that a man's final act must be coherent with his life. He convened a small circle of friends in his study, men who had followed him through hard debates and harder nights. They came without fanfare, old companions, eyes lined with fatigue and affection. They spoke in low tones, aware that words could only sketch the edges of a conviction he already carried. Cato had thought long on such questions. He had known triumph and defeat in the Senate, stood as an unbending voice against corruption, and accepted exile and obscurity rather than compromise his judgment. Now, with the city's fate sealed, and the banners of a new master on the horizon, a choice confronted him that went beyond politics and strategy. Whether to live beneath the shadow of rule he deemed unjust, or to preserve his integrity by choosing his own end. When the moment came, it was not a sudden, frenzied thing. Cato moved with the quiet exactness of a man used to living by principle. He did not shout. He did not curse. He accepted what he had decided to do with the calm of a man who had trained himself to meet destiny with reason, not with panic. "Remember," he said to those near him, "that a good life is more than a long one. You are Romans. Be faithful to what is right." His words were not dramatic flourishes but last instructions, a counsel to remain upright when the world bowed. Cato tearing his own wounds open rather than yield. The morning air in Utica was thin and cool, a pale light softening the villas and the distant olive groves. Cato the younger moved through his house with the same deliberate calm he had carried all his life. No swagger, no show, only that inward steadiness that had made him a moral lodestar for friend and foe alike. News had arrived with the clarity of inevitability. Caesar's power would not be bargained with. The Republic, as Cato had conceived it, was finished as a living thing. What remained for a man of principle? The wound itself, if we may speak of it plainly, was undertaken by Cato as a means to an end, not a spectacle. He aimed to retain control over his fate rather than be paraded as a conquered curiosity. Pain was present. Pain is part of what it means to be alive. But the scene was not a tableau of gore. It was a household full of friends who wept in quiet, who steadied his hand when asked, who spoke to him of reason, courage, and the necessity of the soul to remain unbuyable. Whatever physical suffering occurred was kept out of the story's center. The center remained the moral drama, the refusal to yield one's judgment to force. As his strength waned, Cato spoke of simple things. The law is an ideal to be preserved, the duty of a citizen, the importance of teaching by example rather than by compromise. He asked his friends to remain free in conscience, to resist the seduction of expediency, and to care for those they could. There were no grand prophecies of vengeance, only an insistence on dignity. That death so met did not render him a tragic footnote, but preserved his life's argument intact. When silence finally gathered, it did not feel like defeat. The men in that room carried with them a clarity that Cato's choice had bestowed. To them, and to history, he had shown that there exist limits beyond which a man refuses to be coerced. His death was meant to be a living lesson, that some principles are not negotiable, that the soul's governance by virtue matters more than political survival. The story of Cato's last act traveled across seas and ages, retold not to glorify suffering, but to underline a stubborn moral truth. People would argue whether suicide is ever justified. Stoic readers would hold up Cato as an exemplar of integrity. Others would condemn him as reckless. But for those who stood in his house that morning, the memory was of a man who chose coherence between life and end, who would rather puncture his own body than let tyranny write the rest of his chapter for him. In the end, what remained was not the physical detail of the wound, but the lesson that there are times when integrity asks more of a person than survival alone can satisfy. Cato's act was intended to protect the last untransferable thing, his moral authority, and in that choice he risked everything he had to preserve the one thing he could not give away.